On the eve of the Iwo Jima landings in February 1945, as the transports of the 5th Marine Division rolled in the Pacific swell, and the air filled with the sound of clanking gear and whispered tension, a young Marine named Tony Stein was preparing to carry into battle a weapon no Marine armorer had ever officially issued, approved, or even imagined. It was called the Stinger, an improvised ground version of the Browning AN-M2 aircraft machine gun, and its creation was a story of necessity, ingenuity, and a Marine's refusal to accept limitations. Stein, a former tool and die maker from Dayton, Ohio, had learned the inner workings of firearms the way other men learned the lines of their palms. Before joining the 28th Marines, he had served in the elite Marine Parachute Regiment, where he had developed a reputation as a technical savant, able to repair weapons under fire, modify malfunctioning guns on the spot, and squeeze performance out of equipment that most Marines considered beyond saving. But even among his peers, the Stinger was something different, a weapon born from aircraft scrap, built with the precision of a machinist and the audacity of a frontline Marine who understood that on Iwo Jima, raw firepower could mean the difference between life and death for his entire company. The Stinger began its life as the Browning AN-M2 .30 caliber machine gun, a lightweight, high rate of fire weapon originally mounted in the wings of Navy fighters and dive bombers such as the F-4F Wildcat, F-6F Hellcat, and SBD Dauntless. These guns fired nearly twice as fast as the standard infantry Browning M1919A4, producing a blistering 1,200 rounds per minute, far beyond anything a ground unit carried. But the AN-M2 had no stock, no trigger group suited for infantry use, no sights appropriate for ground combat, and no cooling system designed for sustained firing. To the Navy, it was an airplane weapon. To Stein, it was a potential answer to a battlefield problem that had haunted him since Bougainville. Marines often faced fortified Japanese positions with too little suppressive fire to cover movement. The Marine Corps in early 1945 lacked a light, high-rate machine gun capable of shredding bunkers and pinning down entrenched defenders. The Japanese on Iwo Jima dug into miles of tunnels and reinforced concrete bunkers carved into Mount Suribachi, were expected to fire from concealed apertures with interlocking fields of fire, positions that would require overwhelming volume of fire to neutralize. Stein knew the AN-M2 could deliver that volume. So in the months before Iwo Jima, while the 28th Marines trained in Hawaii, Stein and a handful of fellow Marines quietly collected 6 AN-M2s from aircraft salvage depots. Working with files, torches, scrap metal, and whatever parts they could scrounge, they transformed the sleek, wing-mounted guns into brutally efficient ground weapons. Stein machined a custom trigger assembly, welded a makeshift buttstock, and added a carrying handle taken from a bar. He attached a bipod from a 1918 A2, mounted improvised sights, and fitted a flash suppressor to tame the blinding muzzle flare. The finished product weighed less than a standard light machine gun, yet fired almost twice as fast. When Stein squeezed the trigger, the Stinger did not chatter like a normal Browning. It roared. Marines who witnessed test firing said it looked like a hose spraying sparks. Even within the division, the Stinger was treated with a mixture of skepticism and awe. It was never listed on any official Marine Corps table of equipment, never approved by ordnance officers, and never standardized. But in the Pacific, improvisation was survival. Commanders in the 28th Marines, men who knew Stein's skill and trusted his judgment, allowed him to keep the Stinger. They knew that on D-Day at Iwo Jima, where intelligence warned of hidden pillboxes, intersecting machine gun nests, and volcanic terrain funneling Marines into narrow killing zones, a weapon with the Stinger's rate of fire might be the only way to silence a bunker long enough for assault teams to close the distance. In the final days before the landing, Stein broke down the gun repeatedly, checking every spring, polishing feed components, filing burrs, honing the bolt, and rehearsing magazine changes. He knew the Stinger was temperamental. Aircraft guns were never meant to operate in sand, ash, or the choking sulfur dust of Suribachi's slopes. But Stein trusted his hands and the mechanics of the gun. He understood its rhythm, its heat, its quirks. On February 19, 1945, the morning the ramps lowered on Green Beach, Stein would become the only Marine in history to land on Iwo Jima carrying a Stinger. And within minutes of touching the black volcanic sand, he would demonstrate exactly why he built it. The Japanese defenders, concealed in the labyrinth beneath Suribachi, believed no individual Marine could generate enough firepower to threaten their hardened positions. They had never imagined a man carrying the firepower of a fighter plane. They had never imagined Tony Stein. The moment the first wave of the 28th Marines hit Green Beach on the morning of February 19, 1945, the world dissolved into volcanic ash, tracer fire, and the deafening concussion of artillery erupting from the hidden galleries of Mount Suribachi. The Japanese had allowed the landing craft to touch the sand unopposed, waiting until the beaches were swollen with men, steel, and equipment before unleashing the storms of bullets they had calibrated for months. In seconds, the shoreline became a maze of blasts and geysers of black sand. Marines scrambling for cover that didn't exist, pinned beneath unseen gun positions buried deep within the mountain. It was into this chaos that Tony Stein stepped, carrying the Stinger slung in his hands like a talon of forged steel. He wore no helmet, only his cap, backwards as he preferred when firing. And he moved with the practiced agility of a man who knew that stillness on this beach meant death. As Company A advanced only a few dozen yards from the waterline, Japanese machine guns opened up, sweeping the beach with intersecting cones of fire from pillboxes invisible behind volcanic ridges. Marines dropped everywhere, cut down before they could even locate the enemy muzzles. Officers shouted orders drowned out by the roar of Type 92 heavy machine guns. The landing itself had become a death trap. The only way out was forward, and forward was impossible unless someone broke the stranglehold of fire, pinning the entire battalion to the beach. Stein didn't wait for orders. He sprinted ahead of his squad, the Stinger tucked tight under his arm, and charged directly toward the source of the heaviest automatic fire. The moment he crested a small berm of volcanic ash, he planted the bipod, leaned into the shoulder stock he had built with his own hands, and squeezed the trigger. The Stinger screamed. Its 1,200 rounds per minute shriek cut through the battlefield like a tearing sheet of metal. Tracers poured from the muzzle in a solid beam, cutting across the mouth of a Japanese pillbox camouflaged beneath volcanic stone. Marines around him stared. This wasn't the rhythmic bark of a Browning 1919. This was something else altogether. A torrent of fire so dense that it stunned even the Japanese defenders who had trained for 2 years to fight precisely this battle. The first pillbox fell silent within seconds. Stein shifted his aim and fired again, sending a dozen more bursts into a second firing slit from which rifle grenades had been launching. Marines surged forward to clear it, shouting back that it was empty. Every man inside had been killed or forced to flee deeper into the tunnels. But Stein never stayed in one place long enough to become a target. He rose from his firing position and sprinted back down the beach under a hail of fire, weaving between wounded Marines and shattered landing craft. Men shouted after him, thinking he was retreating. He wasn't. He was out of ammunition, and the Stinger burned through ammo belts like a furnace. Stein sprinted all the way to the shoreline where supplies were being dumped in a chaotic tangle by Navy beach parties. He grabbed a fresh load of .30 caliber linked belts, often carrying them draped over his shoulders like heavy scarves, before running straight back into the maelstrom toward the front lines. That was the first trip. He would repeat this insane circuit 8 times throughout the day, each time lugging precious ammunition forward under direct fire, each time returning to the front
to rip apart another machine gun nest or sniper position that was stalling the advance. His fellow Marines began calling him the one-man assault squad. Every time the Stinger barked, Marines surged forward. Every time it fell silent, Japanese machine guns resumed their deadly rhythm. Stein became the hinge upon which the entire company's advance turned. At one point, Company A was pinned by a concrete pillbox with overlapping fields of fire covering an entire sector of the beach. Every attempt to flank or suppress it had failed. The casualties around it were mounting. Stein crawled to within 30 yards of the bunker, planted the Stinger, and unleashed a stream of fire directly into the firing slit. The gun's rate of fire was so intense that it chipped away at the edges of the embrasure, chewing through stone, breaking apart sandbags, and suppressing the defenders long enough for a demolition team to move in and blast the entrance. Marines later swore that Stein single-handedly opened the first real path off the beach for the 28th Marines. His Medal of Honor citation would confirm that he destroyed at least 8 entrenched positions and killed approximately 20 Japanese defenders in the space of a few hours. But those numbers, impressive as they were, did little to capture the significance of his actions. On Iwo Jima, the Japanese defense plan relied on tight, overlapping automatic fire to prevent Marines from ever establishing a foothold. Stein disrupted that plan with an improvised weapon, firing at twice the rate the Japanese expected. His Stinger didn't just kill enemies, it shocked them, overwhelmed them, and shattered the tempo of their fire. By midday, Stein's reputation had already begun to spread across the battalion. Marines whispered about the guy with the aircraft gun, some wondering out loud if he was even human. How could someone run that fast under fire? How could he carry that much ammunition? How could he fire a weapon like that without tearing his arms apart? But those who knew him understood. Stein was a craftsman and a fighter, a Marine whose mind and body were tuned to the brutal demands of Pacific combat. And on February 19, 1945, at the foot of Suribachi, the Japanese garrison encountered a form of firepower they had never seen. A Marine who brought the wrath of an aircraft gun to the ground.
By early afternoon on February 19, 1945, the volcanic sands of Green Beach had become a graveyard of twisted landing craft, shattered flamethrowers, burned-out Amtraks, and the bodies of Marines who had never made it more than a few yards inland. The Japanese had prepared for this exact moment for months, mapping every inch of beach from within their underground fortress network and aligning their machine guns so tightly that any movement above the sand invited instant death. For most units, breaking this interlocking fire meant calling forward flamethrower teams, demolition men, tanks, or naval bombardment. Yet all those assets were delayed or trapped by the chaos of the landing. For the first crucial hours of the assault, the only thing standing between annihilation and a foothold was raw initiative. And in the center of the 28th Marines' advance, that initiative had a name: Tony Stein. What Stein accomplished with the Stinger was not simply the destruction of individual pillboxes, it was the systematic dismantling of the Japanese defensive rhythm. The defenders on Suribachi relied on a cycle: fire, relocate through tunnels, reappear at new apertures, and fire again, all while staying hidden from naval guns or tanks. But Stein's weapon was so fast, so loud, and so overwhelming that it broke this pattern. When he opened fire, Japanese machine gun teams were forced to flatten themselves inside their galleries, unable to return fire without risking instant suppression or death. Stein's bursts bought seconds, sometimes only seconds, but seconds that meant everything, for Marines to crawl forward, find new cover, and assault auxiliary firing ports. The psychological effect on the Americans was just as profound. For troops pinned to the beach, unable to see the enemy, and losing men by the minute, Stein's Stinger was a beacon, a violent metallic roar that signaled something was being done, that someone was pushing forward, that the deadlock had a crack in it after all. Survivors from Company A recalled that the first moment of real hope came when they saw Stein sprint past them, helmetless, eyes fixed ahead, the Stinger blazing like a continuous line of white-hot sparks.
It was like watching someone drag an aircraft's guns across the ground, one Marine wrote later. At one critical point, a concealed machine gun above a rocky rise cut down 2 squad leaders and halted an entire platoon. The firing slit was almost invisible, protected by heavy stone and masked by shadows. Several assaults had failed, grenades rolled harmlessly down the slope, and rifle fire chipped uselessly at volcanic rock. Stein crawled forward alone, dragging the Stinger behind him. When he rose to one knee and fired, the effect was instantaneous. The high cyclic blasts hammered the aperture with such density that even Marines behind him flinched. Stein kept firing until the Stinger's barrel glowed white and smoke poured from the cooling shroud. Moments later, the machine gun inside fell silent. When Marines finally cleared the position, they found the interior shredded. And Stein didn't stop. Time after time, he left positions of relative safety to charge directly at the next threat. He shifted the Stinger from bipod-supported fire to hip fire, sweeping trenches or cave entrances in short, brutal arcs that forced defenders to withdraw deeper into the tunnels. Japanese soldiers who expected American light machine guns or bars instead encountered a weapon that fired nearly twice as fast as their own heavy guns, and with a distinct, punishing rhythm that was completely foreign to them. Several captured Japanese soldiers later reported believing that an entire platoon of automatic weapons had been concentrated in one sector. Yet Stein's influence extended far beyond the rounds he fired. His repeated dashes back to the beach to retrieve ammunition, 8 trips in total, kept Company A's momentum alive during the most vulnerable phase of the landing. He carried belts of .30 caliber rounds on his shoulders, sometimes dragging additional ammo cans or grabbing discarded gear to assist wounded men on the return run. Each trip exposed him to Japanese riflemen and machine gunners who, baffled by his behavior, fired relentlessly at him but failed to stop him. His feats bordered on impossible. He would sprint through open zones that had been killing grounds only seconds before, disappearing into smoke and reappearing minutes later with enough ammunition to keep the Stinger alive for another assault. Commanders quickly realized that Stein's firepower was tipping the balance in an entire sector of the beach. What tanks and flamethrowers could not reach, Stein hit with aircraft-grade suppression. What artillery could not pinpoint, Stein tore open with direct fire. What the Japanese believed impenetrable, Stein shattered through sheer aggression and technical ingenuity. As the 28th Marines finally clawed their way up the lower slopes of Suribachi by late afternoon, the after-action reports began to reflect a pattern. Wherever progress had been made, Stein had been there first. His actions created the first breaches in several of the interlocking fire lanes that formed the foundation of the Suribachi defense. Without those breaches, the entire company and perhaps the entire push toward the mountain would have been delayed, stalled, or destroyed. By nightfall on February 19, 1945, the Japanese defenders in Stein's sector were shaken in a way their doctrine had never anticipated. They knew how to respond to flamethrowers, grenades, tanks, and artillery. They had no answer for a Marine carrying the firepower of a fighter aircraft. And as word spread through the tunnels that one man had effectively dismantled multiple positions on his own, the defenders began to understand that the Americans were not only relentless, they were unpredictable. The Stinger had changed the psychology of the battlefield. On that first day, the foothold on Iwo Jima had been paid for in blood and heroism. But it had also been bought with innovation, the kind of battlefield improvisation that makes legends. And Tony Stein, with a gun he built himself, had become the embodiment of what Marine initiative could achieve under fire. In the days after the landing on February 19, 1945, the foothold carved out by the 28th Marines began to widen. The long climb toward Mount Suribachi had finally become possible, thanks in no small part to the brutal close-range work done during those first critical hours. But the battle for Iwo Jima was far from over. Suribachi, the volcanic fortress whose guns had slaughtered Marines on the beaches, still loomed above them, honeycombed with tunnels, and defended by the most disciplined Japanese garrison of the war. And though the Stinger had helped break the initial defenses, the enemy now knew exactly what kind of threat Tony Stein represented. They had seen the effects of his weapon. They had heard its terrifying howl, and they wanted him dead. On February 20 and 21, Stein continued to operate with the same fearless aggression he had shown on D-Day. His squad advanced through jagged terrain scarred by mortar blasts and sniper fire, clearing caves and strongpoints one by one. The Stinger was in constant use. Stein fired it in bursts to suppress openings in the rock, forcing Japanese defenders to duck back into their tunnels while flamethrower teams crept forward to finish the job. More than once, he served as the point man, placing himself at the head of an assault element to spot gun emplacements before the rest of his squad walked into an ambush. The fighting around the base of Suribachi was unlike anything Marines had faced on previous islands. There were no easy victories, no rapid breakthroughs, only brutal, grinding combat measured in feet, not yards. Every cave could hide a dozen defenders. Every trench could conceal a machine gun. Every black ridge could erupt in fire. And in this brutal environment, Stein's Stinger became not only a weapon, but a psychological anchor for the Marines who fought beside him. When the Stinger roared, they knew they could move. When it fell silent, they took cover and waited for it to speak again. But the Stinger had limitations. It overheated easily. Belts jammed. Springs wore down under the intense rate of fire. More than once, Stein stripped and reassembled it under incoming fire, his fingers working with the cold precision of a machinist, even as bullets cracked overhead. He had created the weapon. He knew how to tame it. But each time he fired, he exposed himself. The Japanese defenders had learned to recognize the Stinger's distinctive rhythm, and they targeted it relentlessly. By February 22, the 28th Marines had isolated the base of Suribachi and begun the push toward its summit. Stein fought alongside them, still serving as a scout, still carrying the Stinger, still leading small teams into the volcanic labyrinth. That morning, during a firefight that erupted near a large cave complex, Stein spotted Japanese riflemen shifting into flanking positions above his platoon. Without hesitation, he turned the Stinger toward them and fired. The burst scattered the defenders, but it also drew immediate retaliation: grenades, rifle fire, and the unmistakable crack of a sniper. Stein dropped to cover as the Stinger's barrel hissed against the cooling air. The company advanced another 200 yards. They destroyed caves with satchel charges. They cleared trenches with grenades and close-quarters fire. Every gain came at a cost, and the wounded piled up. Stein made repeated runs to bring stretcher teams forward, using the same reckless courage he had shown on D-Day. He knew the terrain. He knew how to move unseen. He knew how to use every rock, crater, and fold in the ground as cover. On March 1, 1945, after the American flag had already been raised on Suribachi, the fight for the southern part of the island intensified. Japanese defenders still held hundreds of positions, and the Marines were pushing into some of the most fortified terrain of the entire campaign. Stein, now serving primarily as a guide and scout, moved at the front of a small patrol, tasked with clearing enemy-held caves. The Stinger, battered from days of use and lacking spare parts, had been replaced by a standard rifle for this mission. His commanders wanted to keep him alive. The loss of the Stinger was painful, but losing Stein was worse. The patrol moved cautiously through a ravine carved into the volcanic terrain. Snipers had been active in the area all morning. Stein, as always, insisted on being at the front. He raised a hand, signaling his men to slow. He had spotted movement ahead. And then a single shot rang out. It came from a concealed sniper's nest high in the rocks. The bullet struck Stein before he could react, dropping him instantly. Marines immediately returned fire, rushing forward to pull him to safety, but the damage was done. The man who had charged across Green Beach with an aircraft gun in his hands, who had made 8 ammo runs under fire, who had ripped apart pillboxes that had stalled entire platoons, was gone. Word spread quickly through the battalion. The silence that followed was heavy, stunned, and painful. Marines who had survived the first day because of him now sat in the volcanic dust and stared at the empty place where he should have been. Tony Stein was recommended for the Medal of Honor within days. His commanders wrote that his actions on February 19 were so conspicuously above and beyond the call of duty that they defy adequate description. The citation would later describe him as fearless, indomitable, and incredibly selfless, but those words barely touched the truth. Stein had not simply been brave, he had been essential. He had created opportunities where none existed, broken defensive positions that had slaughtered Marines, and risked his life repeatedly for his comrades. His death was a reminder of the terrible price paid to take the island. But his legacy, like the Stinger, endured. A weapon born of ingenuity, a Marine born to lead from the front. A moment in history where one man's aggression, skill, and refusal to quit changed the fate of his entire battalion. When the guns finally fell silent on Iwo Jima and the smoke drifted out to sea, the island stood as one of the bloodiest battlegrounds in Marine Corps history, an unforgiving black fortress whose capture cost more American lives than any other Pacific landing. Yet among the tens of thousands of men who fought there, the story of Tony Stein and his handmade weapon still rose above the carnage, becoming a symbol of Marine ingenuity, improvisation, and raw courage under impossible conditions. The Stinger, a machine gun never listed on any ordnance ledger, became one of the most legendary weapons of the Pacific War, not because of its technical performance, but because of what one Marine did with it in a single day. After Stein's death on March 1, 1945, word of his heroism spread throughout the 5th Marine Division. Marines who had witnessed his actions spoke about him as if he were a force of nature, an unstoppable engine of aggression who'd charged headlong into the worst fire on the beach without hesitation. His Medal of Honor citation, issued posthumously, attempted to capture the scale of his actions. 8 destroyed machine gun positions, approximately 20 Japanese soldiers killed, countless lives saved by his repeated ammunition runs. But even those numbers felt inadequate. The real measure of Stein's impact was written in the ground he helped take, the Marines who lived because he bought them precious seconds, and the defensive network of Suribachi that cracked open because one man brought the firepower of an aircraft to bear against fortified ground defenses. In the months after the battle, the Stinger itself became the subject of fascination among historians, ordnance officers, and fellow Marines. Only 6 were ever built, all improvised from salvaged Browning AN-M2 aircraft guns. Stein's version was the most famous. The gun was lighter and faster than any standard infantry machine gun, but it was also fragile, prone to overheating, and impossible to maintain without a machinist's touch. It existed for one mission on one island for one Marine. The weapon's short life only added to its legend. Marine Corps analysts later noted that Stein had demonstrated a concept the Corps would adopt after the war, the need for a lightweight, high rate of fire automatic weapon for close assault. The M60 machine gun, adopted in the 1950s, reflected lessons drawn in part from battles like Iwo Jima, where suppressive fire saved lives and opened ground that would otherwise remain lethal. Stein's Stinger was a crude precursor, a glimpse of the firepower future infantry would one day take for granted. Yet the true legacy of Tony Stein did not lie in armament theory. It lay in the ethos he embodied. He was an ordinary Marine who refused to be ordinary, a machinist who built a weapon because the battlefield demanded it, a parachutist who fought like an entire squad, a man who saw his comrades dying on the sand and ran, again and again, into the storm to get them the ammunition they needed. In this sense, Stein represented something timeless, the Marine who adapts, improvises, and overcomes not because he is told to, but because he cannot imagine doing anything less. His example became part of the 28th Marines' identity and later part of the broader Marine Corps heritage. Drill instructors told his story. Historians cited his actions as a model of individual initiative. Veterans spoke of him with the reverence normally reserved for legendary figures like John Basilone or Daniel Daly. But Stein's legacy was also deeply human. He had been married less than a year before the invasion. He was 24 years old when he died. His Medal of Honor was presented to his widow, Joan, who accepted it with quiet dignity. Behind the myth of the Stinger and the heroism on the black sands of Iwo Jima was a young man who believed he was simply doing his job, protecting the men to his left and right. As the decades passed, the memory of Iwo Jima remained etched into the nation's consciousness. The flag raising, the volcanic sloops, and the unimaginable cost. Amid those large symbols, Stein's story endured as a reminder that wars are won not only by grand strategies or overwhelming numbers, but by the actions of individuals who rise above fear and circumstance. Today, a preserved Tiger tank or the wreck of a sunken battleship may tell part of the story of World War II. But the Stinger, the weapon Tony Stein carried, is more elusive. No original examples survive in usable condition. What remains instead are photographs, scattered parts in museums, and the memories of the Marines who saw it roar across the beach like a dragon's breath. And perhaps that is fitting. The Stinger was never meant to be a mass-produced weapon. It was a one-off instrument of survival, built by a Marine for a battle that demanded the impossible. Just as Tony Stein was never meant to be an ordinary rifleman, the Stinger was never meant to be an ordinary gun. Both existed for a single moment in history, a moment when the tide of battle hung by a thread, when the lives of hundreds depended on the courage of one man. On February 19, 1945, the Japanese defenders of Suribachi witnessed something they believed impossible: a lone Marine charging their strongest positions with the firepower of a fighter aircraft in his hands. And in that moment, Tony Stein carved his place among the great legends of the United States Marine Corps, forever remembered not just for what he carried, but for who he was.